welcome back to the Venture Podcast. I am actually, where are we, Bryce? Tell us about where we are.
Today we're in San Francisco, California.
It's a long way from home, but excited to be here. We're here with Andrew Miklas. Andrew's the founder of PagerDuty. He's also found his own venture capital firm, as well as he is a visiting partner right now at Combinator. So a lot of cool things to talk about today. Thanks for coming on, and thank you for giving us the time, Andrew.
Of course, happy to.
Awesome. So typically the way we'll start off is we'd like to get a little background on what your upbringing was like and what you were kind of interested in back then. So what were you interested back in your high school days? Did you take an early interest in tech, computers, coding? Did you play sports? What were you into?
Yeah, I mean, I've been interested in computers, almost as early as I can remember. I think like even as like a 8-year-old, I was sort of parents brought me first computer, kind of played around with it, and it's interesting, right? It's so funny to think back to what it was like back in the late 80s. It was very different, but it is funny. It's still sort of informs it's sort of the trends you see happening today. So I'm very thankful to actually have that sort of that history.
And that, I guess, your interest in computers and stuff, that took you to Waterloo, right? Where you pursued a computer science degree or software engineering degree?
Yeah, software engineering. So I was actually pretty lucky. I think like a lot of people don't know what they want to study, coming out of high school and going into university. For me, I knew it was like, okay, I'm like picking between like computer science, computer engineering, software engineering. Like it was all pretty contained. I knew I wanted to do something in that space. So I ended up choosing software engineering at the University of Waterloo. I was actually in the first year that they offered that program, so it was. I think it actually. Yeah. It's definitely true, and I think that first class actually attracted a lot of like interesting people who were kind of up for like a little bit of experimentation, because they didn't know what the curriculum exactly was going to be like, and there were some funny stories of that first year. I remember. We all did a class. We basically took a class, and in the end, they were like, "All right, we didn't do this class right, so you all pass, but we're canceling it for the purposes of prereqs. You'll have to do it again. Sorry, guys." So that was kind of cool to be right there while something was being done for the first time.
Were there people studying at Waterloo then that are now kind of in a similar, are now in San Francisco doing the startup thing? Is that kind of the group that was attracted to that program when it first started out?
Definitely. I mean, look, Alex, who was one of my co-founders at PagerDuty. I mean, I met him basically in first year at Waterloo, and he was. I remember he just came up to me one day and he's like, "You want to do some of our group coursework together?" I was like, "Sure," and that sort of kicked off I don't even know how long, 20 years of working together on stuff. So I think that was my biggest takeaway from Waterloo. I think was the people. A lot of the people from my undergrad I still stay in touch with. And a lot of them actually to answer your question, did actually end up out here. Not all doing startups. I think a lot of people ended up at Google, or in Seattle at Microsoft or Amazon. It was pretty common, but some did end up going down the startup path as well.
Very cool. Jumping to back to that point with Alex, your first co-founder. What was that experience like with him, and what was the first project that you guys worked on together that was maybe outside of the classroom that really made you think, wow, this is a really awesome person to work with and someone who I want to build my first company with?
So I'll tell you about stuff in the classroom. It was all kinds of coursework, lab work. Some of it was literally chemistry stuff. Some of it was more programming assignments. I do remember some things though. It was very interesting. I think working together. We were very. People used to say, you guys are always fighting all the time. We would definitely grind at each other in certain ways, but the work quality that we put out, while very painful, I think at times for both of us, was good. We did, I think, good work together. And so then when we decided, okay, what should we do a company or something like that? I think that was at least something going on in the back of my mind, was okay, we've done this before. We know that we together actually do manage to put together some pretty high quality stuff. We So basically most of that time, like 2001 to 2006, like it was all coursework. I didn't really do a lot of stuff like outside of school. What happened around, actually, I guess I would say one thing that we did do together was we interned at Amazon in 2005. So basically my final 2 co-op terms I did at Amazon in Seattle, and he did them there as well. And then what happened then is he got we both got the full-time offer to go work at Amazon after graduation in 2006. And he took it, and I decided to go to grad school at the University of Toronto to do CS grad school there. And so that was like a sort of a period where we stayed in touch with each other, but we weren't actively working together.
And what was the decision behind that? Like, why didn't you choose to go to do Amazon full-time, and why did you pursue school instead?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what had happened was I had done some work while at Amazon. I'd done some work that had basically caught a young professor's attention, and he was just about to set up a lab. He had just gotten faculty at the University of Toronto and had reached out to me. I didn't actually know. He had read a report that I wrote internally at Amazon and looked at a project I did, and he sort of sent me this email out of the blue and was like, "Hey, I'm Stefan, and if this is the kind of thing you like doing, you should really consider giving grad school a try." And so it wasn't actually like I didn't have in my head a preformed idea like, oh, I should do grad school. It was, I kind of thought about it, but this guy reached out and basically sort of said, you should give it a try. And so I was like, all right, there's always Amazon. I can always go back to Amazon after I'm done with this.
So I guess you're doing grad school. Mm-hmm. You're a co-founder, not yet co-founder. Is at Amazon.
Yeah.
What was the next step? What am I missing between that period and then eventually taking action on this startup idea? And first of all, why don't you tell us how you got the idea for PagerDuty?
Yeah, so I'll take you through sort of the 06, 07, 08 kind of days. So, a few things were going on. Back then, Facebook, like social media, was something that was really getting a lot of attention. I was going to say the iPhone had just come out, but that might have been a little bit later. But in any event, social media was kind of all the rage, and people were starting to do startups like based around, Facebook apps, stuff like that. I had stayed in touch with Alex, and we both were like, I think Alex was like, hey, maybe we should try to do a company together, and I think he enjoyed his time at Amazon, but was also like, I want there to be more than this. I was sort of at the point where I was wrapping up my master's and, had the option to go on to do the PhD, but was like, do I really want to do this process, right? The master's is 2 years, PhD, of course, is, many more years, and then you're sort of on the faculty search, right? And so what we had started to do probably around the 2008 mark was brainstorm ideas and then put together applications for Y Combinator. So we would sort of sit down and come up with an idea, fill out the application, and send it in. Mm-hmm. And we did this twice, actually. Prior to PagerDuty, we did this twice. It was always me and Alex, and then there was usually somebody else. Like it was different people each time. We put the application together, and then we would get the interview. And then we'd be like, all right, well, what do we have to do now? And so I would fly, I think we did this a few different ways, but usually I would fly out to the West Coast, meet with him and whoever else was putting together this application, and just sort of like lock ourselves in a room for like a week plus and just crank out as much of that product as fast as we could prior to the interview.
Was that just like an MVP? You were trying to get it as quickly as possible to demo in the interview?
That's right. Yeah. So we could build out as much as we could prior to the interview, both to clarify our own thinking as to how the product could work, but also to demonstrate that like literally we can like build the product.
Yeah.
So that was what we did that a couple times, and through a few different ideas, and each time we would get the interview and sort of get YC would decline us for one reason or another, and usually and they were good reasons, like the reasons resonated, and we're like, all right, so that we'll probably stop with that idea. And to be fair, like a lot of the ideas, like the earliest idea was literally like software for students. This is like what everybody does their first time.
Is it a tarpit, as they call it?
Yeah, like 100%. I don't know if that word existed back then, but it was like 100% a tarpit idea. Some of the other ideas I think could have been more interesting. But that was basically what we were doing. And I think, doing this, I think I really enjoyed it, right? Like, working with Alex and whoever else was kind of on the team and just very, very kind of efficiently cranking out software. I think we had a lot of fun. We were like, all right, maybe we could, maybe this is a good sign that we should actually do the startup thing.
So after you did that, I guess a few times, what learnings did you have along the way where you realized, whether your approach was wrong at the beginning, idea aside, that really made, by the time you got to PagerDuty, summer 2010, that allowed that to be, successful, unlike, the previous attempts?
Yeah. So we took, so basically what happened after we did this a few times, we ended up working almost full time. We ended up working full time. We did a few things. One thing was Alex had left his job at Amazon and moved back to Toronto. And we both worked together on consulting, like basically building like e-commerce websites for people. And with the idea that we would be making some money and then doing a little bit of work outside, like making some money and then being able to work outside of hours on our own ideas for a startup. So we did that for a bit. We eventually kind of realized that process was not going to work because it was taking up too much of our time. Basically went into doing the customer work. So we eventually shut that down and then just started working full time on like, okay, how are we going to pick an idea? And we went through a bunch of different ideas. By this point, also Bhaskar had come on the scene. So Bhaskar is PagerDuty's third co-founder. And
he went to Waterloo as well.
He went to Waterloo as well, not in our class. He was in the Compeng class. So we'd kind of like seen each other a few times, but none of us knew each other as well as, me and Alex knew each other the best. Yeah, Bhaskar had also worked for a little while at Amazon. Okay. Nice. So he would have known Alex a little bit through there. But so we sort of all met up at each other's parents' houses. This is basically like the tail end of 2008, beginning of 2009. So we'd all meet up at each other's parents' houses because we all moved back in with our parents. And we're like, all right, what are we going to do? And we went through a bunch of different iterations of these of ideas. And we sort of had like, I don't want to use the word like framework for evaluating ideas because that makes it sound like much more deliberate than it was. But we did have kind of like certain ways that we would think about things. So like one thing we thought about was like, okay, what's become possible now that wasn't possible like 2 years ago? So by this point, the iPhone definitely was a thing. The App Store was a thing. And we were like, okay, what can we do with this like, new computing platform that we couldn't build a business that way before. So we spent a bunch of time looking at like various iPhone stuff. And actually, when we came up with the idea for PagerDuty, it was Bhaskar had the idea for it. And one of the things we were talking about at the time was this service called Twilio. And so Twilio's basically like this product that makes it really easy to build applications that interface with the phone network, like voice calls, SMS, all that stuff. They had just come out kind of in that 2008, 2009 range. And we were like, oh, we can now build an application that does phone calls. What can we do with this, right? So that was like one lens we were kind of looking at. We were like, all right, what can we build with this Twilio thing? And I think Bhaskar had said, oh, well, maybe there's something we can do around Amazon's paging process that we could do, build a product like that. So, and just to sort of back all that up a little bit, like Amazon had this process for how they built and run software that I was exposed to in my internships at 2005, and Alex and Bhaskar, obviously, because they worked there for some period, saw even more of. But that was very, very different than how the rest of the market worked. In particular, they had engineers. Engineers would write the software, but then those same engineers were then responsible for making sure that the software was working at all times. And that was very unusual. Most companies at that time did not work that way. Engineers would write the software and give them to a different kind of group, like an operations group, to actually run it. But in Amazon's case, it was just the same people. But to make that work, you basically had to have this concept called PagerDuty. That was actually what Amazon called it internally. Oh. And you would carry a physical pager. Your team would have a pager, and when you would physically swap it like every week at Tuesday at noon or something like this. And that was basically like, okay, you're now on call because I'm giving you the pager. If it goes off, you have to like fix whatever the problem is. And so we were all familiar with that approach to how things worked. We're like, oh yeah, we could build a system that doesn't involve physical pagers. We could just use people's cell phones and just ring their phones when there were problems. So that was kind of this, like that was kind of where the idea came from. And I think the third thing that kind of caused us to like really look closely at PagerDuty as an idea was that, remember I was telling you about our consulting work that we were doing. We had actually had an issue a couple of weeks before where the customers who we were working for site went down, and we had automated systems that told us this, and it was sending email to our work email addresses, which we weren't checking on the weekends. So the customer's site was basically down for the whole weekend, and we didn't realize this till Monday morning. And the client was a bit like, what happened here? And I think for both me and Alex, we're like, oh yeah, we know how to solve this problem. You set up PagerDuty. Yes. And we went looking for, a product similar to what Amazon had internally to do this, and like could not find anything. Like it just didn't exist. And so it was those three things that like the fact that we just experienced the problem, the fact that Amazon, like we knew that they had this way of organizing themselves that featured a system like this, and that as far as we could tell, this product just became possible to build, or at least possible for us to build because of Twilio, that sort of set us on the path of building PagerDuty.
Interesting. And I know a big thing at Y Combinator, kind of I guess one of their target themes is inspired developer tools, inspired developer tooling, inspired by I guess what is currently seen in industry at some company taking what an internal tool and then going and building a startup, so all companies have access to that sort of thing. I guess is that something that do you think that's a part of the reason why Y Combinator maybe wanted to bring you on as well, because you had experience in that field?
I think so. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. But what was actually interesting is the first time we applied to YC on this idea, we got rejected. We didn't even get the
same idea.
We didn't even get the flight down for this one. So the other two, actually, we got the flight down, did the interview. For this idea, for PagerDuty, we applied for it, and they were like, guys, the ideas are getting worse.
Wow.
So fortunately, though, we actually stuck with the PagerDuty idea. I think we had a little more internal conviction on it ourselves, and applied a year later and did get in. By that point, we actually had revenue, so that was something that helped a little bit too. Actually, a lot of our early customers were YC companies,
awesome.
So that also helped. Yeah.
Why don't you tell us the story of maybe one of your first enterprise clients? And I mean, at the time, I imagine you didn't have an office. This was your first kind of client, first revenue source. Like, how did you convince them or get them on board and get them to think that this is a product that they would actually use? Did you charge them right up front? Did you have a little bit of a free trial for them to test out the product? How did that work?
Yeah, I'll tell you. Okay, so a very early story here. So with PagerDuty, we started working on the product in February of 2009, and then launched it in June of 2009, like a very MVP. It's a very, very basic product. And, we actually had people sign up for it and use it. And it still actually amazes me to this day that people signed up and used it, because it was missing so many features. But I think that in retrospect, that was like, okay, people actually need this because they're willing to put up with all of these deficiencies. But one of the things that the product didn't have was a billing system. So we didn't charge for the product at all. Like, it was just for free. And one of the things that was really, in retrospect, I think also we didn't want to scare potential customers off. We're like, you know what? We just want usage. We don't want there to be any question as to, is this worth the price, or you have to go through some budgeting process. We just want you to use it. Yeah. But I think what was interesting is that we had people tell us that was the wrong thing to do. And in the end, we actually agreed with them. Because what was happening is we had some subset of customers were just using us almost for hobby projects, or things where they were never going to pay us at all. And frankly, those were the customers who we shouldn't be listening to anyways, right? But then we had other customers who were at big companies who wanted to use PagerDuty, but they would basically call us up and be like, all right, you're not charging us. It sort of feels like you're three guys in a garage. And of course we're like, yeah. And so we're a little worried about this. What's the story? Like, are you going to like one day start charging and it's going to be way too expensive? Are you are you just going to go out of business one day and leave us high and dry? So the moral of the story here was that the customers who are actually going to eventually become our customers actually wanted us to charge them. They wanted us to have that discussion with them. They wanted to kind of understand how we were thinking about it. And they wanted to understand that like we were interested in building a business and not just ourselves running a hobby project. And they saw correctly, I think, that charging was part of that.
So charging was almost like an element of professionalism and like legitimacy to your business.
To our customers, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I mean, Bryce and I are both doing startup stuff, and one of my fears is charging the client way too early and scaring them away.
Yeah.
So that's interesting that charging actually provides a little bit more conviction for the user of the product. I've never thought about it that way.
Yeah, certainly for B2B products. I don't profess to know for sure for consumer how this would work, but B2B, they definitely wanted it.
Yeah.
If PagerDuty didn't exist today and you were launching it into the market, would you still have proceeded with that product-led growth strategy, or would you have done something a little different?
That's an interesting question. So I think we would have, I think even today I would still try with the product-led growth approach. I don't think I would have done it for free for any stretch of time, but I would have done the product-led growth piece. And I think it's been a long time since I've been at PagerDuty, and so I don't know for sure, but certainly at the time I left, most of our customers, even our largest enterprise customers, had some experience on the product through the PLG motion. Okay, you're asking about like our first enterprise customer. Like one of our early enterprise customers was Apple. And, when we talked to them, it was always very funny, right? Because you would like onboard some other team at Apple and they'd be like, look guys, I don't know if you're like ready for us. Like, what are we going to do here? And we'd tell them like, you're team number 8 at Apple. There's 7 other teams. They're all dispersed throughout the company. And they're like, oh, okay, no problem. We can swipe the credit card and go with this. Yeah. But the important part of this was that when we started to do actual enterprise sales, a lot of the early stuff was just going back to those companies like Apple and going like, you have like 8 different credit cards rolling around here with 8 different account owners. We can help you with this. We can get you onto an annual contract. We can amalgamate this. We can do discounting. We can do upfront annual payment, which actually a lot of companies prefer for various reasons related to budgeting. So I guess what I'm saying is that PLG motion didn't actually inhibit us from doing enterprise sales in the beginning. The PLG motion, it actually got us into those. We were collecting money from Apple before we had a contract with Apple. Yeah. So it's sort of it's like it was both. It was PLG and enterprise together.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool.
Did that mean with product-led growth? Does that mean? At what point did you hire on a sales team, or was that even necessary within the first year or two?
So we hired our first 2 salespeople, I believe, in around was either 2011 or 2012, probably 2011.
Yeah.
And it was 2 of them, and the interesting thing was they were both ex-engineers. Actually, one was a sales guy from a company in a related field, but he converted from an engineer to a sales guy in that company. Mm. The other guy was someone who we had actually hired as an engineering intern, a UW co-op student, who came up to me, right? I was the CTO at PagerDuty, managing engineering, and was like, I think I want to be a sales guy. I want a quota. And I was like, did Alex put you up to this? Like, something's going on here, because no engineer ever says this. Yeah. He was our most productive sales guy from like the time we hired him through to I think after I left the company, and the sales team had been like rebuilt like under 3 different VPs each time. And it was because he was an ex-engineer. He knew the product. He knew what engineers wanted. He could speak intelligently about how you could use the product to solve various problems that the customer was having. He was just really good at it. And I think Well, what was your question again? It was, when did we hire enterprise sales? So a lot of what those guys were doing, those first two sales guys, was going back and looking at our existing customers and basically saying, all right, when you see Microsoft as a logo, and you see that they have like a few dozen users, well, obviously they could have more. How can we do that? Yeah. And so that was, and the other thing that was happening was free trial customers, right? If you saw somebody in the trial pipe and you could recognize the logo, but you weren't quite sure if they were going to convert, you'd also call them up and kind of push them along. But in both cases, the sales guys in those early days were not doing like cold outreach so much as they were like, all right, we
explain the product.
Yeah, like you have some experience using the product, whether in free trial or whether on the swipe the credit card thing, and we can keep this going.
Yeah. Was it like kind of like a domino effect in the industry, like where tech companies just started flocking into your software? Like, it seemed like you didn't really need to do any outreach. Yeah. At least at the start.
Kind of. It's interesting. We did outreach, but we did it in our own way. Yeah. And we wouldn't have called it outreach, but it's what it was. Yeah. So examples where we went to a lot of like local meetups for what was called DevOps engineers. Basically, there was this whole idea. Okay, so remember I was telling you that at Amazon in 2005 they were doing this thing where engineers were on call and responsible for running their software. So Amazon was like, I don't know, 7 years ahead of its time. It probably still is. And those ideas were starting to become very mainstream in sort of, or at least mainstream in tech, in around like 2012, in around that zone. And so we would just go hang out at the conferences that the people who are the thought leaders in that space were hanging out at, and we would show them our product. And I think they were like, oh, this is great. You're building software around these new best practices, and this software is going to help me convert my organization to adopt these new ideas. Mm-hmm. And so that was like one way that we sort of spread. Another thing that happened is that we had some of these thought leaders worked at certain key companies, like Netflix would be an example. And when they started to adopt our software to run these practices in their companies, those other companies would hear about it and would kind of want to do the same thing. I mean, some of the best advertising we would get would be like, a head engineer at, say, Netflix would be describing how they keep their streaming service running, and they'd, be saying we use this system to do this and this system to do this. And, whenever anything goes wrong, of course, we have PagerDuty to tell us, and then they'd be like, this happened. They'd be like, who in the audience here doesn't know about PagerDuty? And then a lot of people raise their hands like, go talk to that guy. Wow. And we would just sit there at the back and be like, thank you.
That's amazing.
And then they'd come and talk to us, and we'd set them up, and and that happened very organically. But we also made sure we were at those conferences and hanging out with those guys.
Right spot at the right time. Yeah. I was gonna ask, like, I mean, a lot of startups, they go through a period where there's like severe challenge where they think, maybe this isn't gonna work, we should shut this down. But it sounds like for the most part, once you found like product market fit, everything kind of just flowed perfectly after. Is that true, or were there parts where there were doubts about this working?
No, I think it's true. I think that which is not to say we didn't have challenges, but we didn't have like we didn't have the like, is what we're building valuable, or do people want it? Mm-hmm. We kind of went through our version of that.
So I guess at what stage did you really know, like, you had PMF? What stage did you truly have that conviction, and you knew you didn't have to maybe change your product too much or add too many features? You just had to really stick to your core offering that you're providing to these engineers.
I mean, by the time we actually, so if you think we started the company in February of 2009. By the time the middle of 2010 rolled around, which was when we applied to YC, we were probably at about 50K in ARR and had some like startup-y logos by then. And I remember by the time we did our demo day, we were at about 100K ARR. And then by the end of that year, we were, I think, at around 200. Wow. Yeah, around 200K ARR. In that phase, I don't know, I think I was, and I think Alex and Beskar too, were like, all right, this shape of this idea is good. I think we always felt like we should be doing more features faster. I mean, I still feel that today. You always feel that, but that the basic idea was right, and that we weren't like kind of going off on a terrible tangent. I think, certainly by the time we did YC, and maybe even somewhat before, I was pretty convinced. I mean, we did have like a few little scares, I guess, like because we started coding in February of 2009, and then we didn't actually release it to anybody until June of 2009. And so I remember the first time we showed it to a friend, and they were like, no, this is not like we don't this doesn't seem to make sense to me. And I was like, oh man, like, or have we made that horrible mistake of developing in a vacuum? Because that is something, we weren't following the normal advice, and maybe we should have been, right? Like, we worked for 4 months without really any touch point with customers, just with our own understanding of the problem. And probably, honestly, the reason that worked was because we had the experience. Exactly. Yeah.
Why don't we transition into, so long story short, PagerDuty takes off, does really, really well. Now you're kind of in this point where you're transitioning out of the company and getting into the VC space with S28. Is that kind of what was going on?
That's right.
So how did you learn, because obviously, like, becoming a founder, you understand how founding companies work, but that doesn't necessarily translate into being like a good venture capitalist. What was your learning there, and what was that transition like?
Yeah. So I think, sort of around 2016 or so, very beginning of 2016, I was a bit like, all right, we've hired, by this point we were at just maybe like 40 million in ARR, probably a little bit shy of 200 employees, something in that general zone. We had hired a full executive team, we hired a VP of product, we hired a VP of engineering, and I was a bit like, all right, like, I feel like, I basically hired, there's experts who are trying to do each of the roles that I'm doing, so like, what am I really here for, kind of thing. And so that was where I was like, all right, maybe it's better to just kind of go do something else, stay on the board of the company so you can still actually have insight. It's not like it's totally opaque to you. And so that's basically what I ended up doing, starting at about the beginning of 2016. It took me a few years before I ended up doing the VC thing. So basically 2016, like the balance of 2016, 2017, I tell people I was like living my 20s in my early 30s, right? So I did a lot of traveling with Aaron. So, cool. We got to kind of, travel around, have a lot of fun. In that space of time, I was like deciding, okay, what should I do next?
Did you miss building while you were away traveling? Was that like an itch you still had?
Yes. Although it's funny, right? Because doing VC, it's not exactly like you're building either, right? And so this is something I go back and forth even in my mind today, right? Like, I'm like, there's only so many ways to be active in tech, right? Like, you can found a company, you can, work at a big company, you can work at a small company, like work at a startup, or do investing in some capacity. There's not like, you can kind of like enumerate all the options. There's not like, there might be like 6 or 7, but there's not like 20. Yeah. Right. And so I kind of like was looking through each of them, trying to figure out what would be interesting. And I sort of remember thinking, well, look, investing is like the farthest thing from what I'm doing right now. And that might be just an interesting kind of skill to learn. I also felt it was going to be interesting from the perspective of learning things that I hadn't learned before in a few different ways. So, like, one thing was at PagerDuty, I was like extremely, as all founders are, like extremely focused on one particular user, one particular customer, one particular problem domain. Like, the world was happening, right? Like, around me, but I was just very narrowly focused in on that one thing. And so I wanted to do something where I would have the ability to look very broadly at stuff. And I think another thing is I was very, I was a technologist, right? Like, I understood coding, I understood engineering, but like things like markets, why people spend money on certain products and not on others, what are the major areas of spend for companies? Like, those were like a little more shaky for me. Yeah. And I was like, maybe doing VC will kind of help, figure some of that stuff out. And so what happened was in, I think the very tail end of 2017, a friend of mine, actually from University of Toronto grad school, So it's always, you see, it's like, I remember when I did grad school, I was like, this is interesting, but is this going to be valuable? But like, if nothing else, that one contact reached out to me and said, hey, look, I've raised with my friends this really big fund. It was a $170 million fund for doing seed investing, and we need help deploying it. And will you come help us do this? And like, where else are you going to get the chance to learn VC with a bunch of other people learning it for the first time as well at that fund size? And so I was like, all right,
great timing.
Yeah.
I'll give it a try.
Startup number 2.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it was, right? It was like we were all like trying to figure out how to do this.
And that was here in San Francisco?
Yeah, that was here. Yeah, so basically what happened is, in terms of where I'm living, we moved down to do Y Combinator, and I guess there was like in theory this idea that maybe we would go back to Toronto, but I think after seeing the pace that the business accelerated at being here, we were like, all right, we're gonna base the company here, and then once that happened, I was like, all right, I'm just gonna stay living here.
Awesome. I'd love to hear the story about the first check that you wrote with that team, but what that was like, the process, whether there was any nerves and uncertainty from because you have never really gone through that process on the VC side.
On the VC
perhaps.
side. Oh, okay. I'll tell you about the angel side because I remember it a little more clearly.
Yes.
All right. So this wasn't quite my first check, but it was like one of my early checks, and I remember meeting with the founder of a company called Retool, and so now it's a very, very big company. At the time, obviously much smaller company. And I remember talking with him about what he was building, and he showed me a demo. And there were a few things that really stood out to me in that demo. I mean, number one, he was like demoing a product to me. It wasn't just an idea or anything like that. He demoed a product. And the second thing that stood out to me was like, wow, this is like a crap ton of product. Like, there's just a lot here. Yeah. And I was like, oh, how big is your team? And he was like, oh, it's just us two. And I was like, all right, that's a lot. That's pretty good. And I talked to him about how long it took him to build it, and I think it was a pivot to that idea in the batch. And so I was just like, I don't know, this is kind of amazing that you've been able to crank this much out. Yeah. The second thing that happened though was I was looking at it, and so Retool's like this thing that like lets you it makes it easy for people to like build like little internal applications. At least that's how it got started. And I was like, this really reminds me of how I learned to program. It reminds me of something called Visual Basic, where you sort of like paint together your UIs and write code in it was basic to like respond to events on the page. I was just like, this is very nostalgic for me or something. And I remember he looked at me and he's like, you're the second person who's told me this. Like, what's basic and what's visual about it? And I was just like, whoa, I'm getting old or something. But I think what was interesting to me was he had stumbled onto this idea. Like it's like almost like ideas are timeless, and they just reoccur again and again under different circumstances and under different platforms. And it's like ideas go out of vogue, but then something about the platform changes. Then all of a sudden they make sense again. And he didn't even realize he was doing this. But to me, I was like, this is going to make a lot of sense, because I remember doing it, back when I was like a little kid learning to program. So that was one of my first checks. It was funny because I was trying to be very disciplined. I was like, I've written my 2 checks for YC batch companies already. This is like the 3rd company, because I saw him a little late. And I was like, oh, what should I do? I don't want to be undisciplined and write more checks than I should. So I split it. I was like, I'll write a half check size. Then I don't have to feel so bad about, that I'm going over budget. Then of course, naturally, that was the one that I should have written like 100 times more check than I was comfortable in. So I've got this tiny check in this company that's turned into like a multi-billion unicorn. But it all worked out, so I'm happy.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think so. We're running down to our last like 10-15 minutes here. So why don't we kind of transition into some final advice you have for like, young entrepreneurs, people interested in startups.
Yeah.
In a way we can kind of segue into that is through YC. So you've both, through PagerDuty, participated in a batch years ago, and now you're a visiting group partner at YC.
Yep.
What do you think makes this place like so special, and why do you think so many of the companies that come out of there are valued to be very, very high and go on to do very well?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to let me think about that. I think a lot of the like advice is almost like timeless, right? It's like, talk to your users, build your product, and repeat. And just keep doing that. Just keep doing that. And I think a lot of people get lost, like just very lost in well, to do a startup means I need to do this, or I need to do that, or I need to go to these events, that events, be in this city, that city. But it's really much simpler than that, right? Just, know your users, build product for them. And so I think that would be my advice to people, right? Is have an idea, have the capability to build it as well, right? And know everything you can about that idea, right? Like what your users do today to solve their problem, what they find deficient, what attempts have been made to solve the problems before, what companies have worked in the past but maybe have fallen away or sort of diverted from working on that. Like know as much as you can.
Yeah. Is that what you would say differentiates the successful or the really good founders at YC from the not so good ones? Is that they're really just focused on the things that need to be focused on, and they're not listening to the outside noise of everything else going on in the batch?
I think it's I don't know if there's like one singular thing, but that is like definitely a big thing. Yeah. I think whenever you're when you're angel investing, right? When you're like picking teams to bet on, I think that something people have told me, and I think this makes sense, is that the best or a very good sign you have is when you leave a meeting and you think to yourself, wow, like I learned something in that meeting. Quite regardless of whether you choose to invest or not, you're just like, having this conversation with this person made me think about, oh yeah, why do users do this right now, and why, oh yeah, whatever did happen to that company, or how they are able, in their talking to you about what it is they want to do, you come away from the conversation just feeling like a lot smarter about some part of like the tech industry or some some part of the world. And that I think founders who do that do better.
Really like the line you said earlier about the cyclical nature of ideas and how the industry's kind of timeless in many ways. That's something I learned. That was interesting.
Cool. No, there's so many ways this gets expressed, and it's some very specific ones you hear from people are like, there's two ways to make money in tech. It's through the bundling process, right? Like different ideas, different products basically getting amalgamated into like one super product that kind of does it all, because people are like, I don't want to deal with like having too many relationships, too many vendors, or build connections between different systems. And then the other way you make money is unbundling, right? It's like, I want best of breed for any given piece. We have to like split all this out, and you just run the circle over and over again, decade after decade. Yeah.
Cool. One question I want to ask you, Andrew, and I have an idea of how you'll answer this because you're super technical, and your roots come from engineering, computer science, software engineering. So there's people out there like Jensen Huang who are saying, no code solutions are becoming the future. Learning how to code is becoming less important, to him at least. There's some people saying this. What are your feelings on that, especially for people who are interested in tech and maybe aren't technical but know they want to go into tech? Like, do you still recommend learn how to code?
Yeah, I mean, I do. Yes, because the thing is I think even as you like, being able to accurately describe the product that you want, right? Whether that's it's a skill, right? And whether that's in like writing a spec or writing code or writing stuff that you're feeding into an AI system that then generates code, it's all kind of the same thing, right? Like you need to understand what it is you want and be able to express it clearly. It's also why actually a lot of really good software engineers, are surprisingly, and I think people don't realize this, excellent writers. Actually, I mean, honestly, like PG from YC is like the canonical example of this, because it's clarity of thought, right? That's what you need, and that is what you learn by learning to program. And you can learn it in other ways too, but that is like a good way to learn it.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot in like some of my friends as well, like the reverse pass of that. I have a lot of friends who, or a decent amount of friends who've studied law and they've switched and become computer scientists, engineers. Maybe it's to that point as well.
I think it's totally. I mean, I started to understand this connection. I used to do again, just sort of in the early days of PagerDuty, right? Like just the founders have to kind of do everything because you haven't hired anyone. I used to do a lot of like PagerDuty's like legal work, like reviewing financing documents and customer contracts, and I was like, okay, there's like a lot of parallels here to like what it is to write code and like understanding an agreement and understanding all the corner cases and and again, it's the same thing. It's that clarity of thought piece. Exactly right.
I have a question in terms of your future. If you theoretically, if you were to start another business, we're in this boom of AI. YC's investing in a ton of applications or a ton of companies at the application layer. Is there any specific layer in the stack that you would like to target if you were to build an AI company today, and why would that be?
Okay, so the stuff that gets a little, and this is all just like my own opinion. I actually, and I'm not even like, I haven't like done a lot of this work myself, which I should caveat that with, right? So it's like some of this might be completely off base. There's a question in my mind like around if you go too close, too far down, like into the dev tooly sort of space, it's like what happens as the underlying models improve? Like, is your thing still going to be necessary? So like the way sometimes I'll ask founders like, okay, yes, you need what you're doing today, but will you need it when GPT-8 comes out like 3 years from now? Or honestly, like in the rate these things advance, maybe even like next year. And so that worries me about stuff at the very very close. Like if the thing you're building is basically like to cover up for some deficiency in the model, I'm like OpenAI thing. I'm like a little bit like this might not be there for so long. So I like the stuff, I feel like that's more at the top. And then in there, what I like is where the AI makes up a part of, it's not the whole thing, but it's like makes up a part of of a broader solution. Like I think a lot of stuff that happens now is we're going to pick some like, specific industry application and we're going to like automate it, right? We're going to build software for it. And a lot of that software is only possible today because of AI. Like I think taking like I've got like a sort of semi-structured document, like an invoice, and you scrape stuff out of it, load it into a thing. So I like that kind of thing. But I think what makes it stick around is like it's not just the AI piece. It's also the fact that it ends up becoming the thing that people like. It becomes the thing that people do their work in. It starts to become the workflow mechanism for a certain kind of job. And it also becomes the repository of like where information gets held, the system of record, sometimes people say. So I like to find things where it's like all of that's happening together, not just we're taking like AI and applying it to something, but really ultimately the AI is just going to fit into some pre-existing platform. Like that sort of stuff I don't like as much.
Very cool.
Yeah.
We're getting down to the wire here, Andrew. We don't want to keep you for too much longer here, so I'll maybe ask one more question. If you have one more question,
sure, sounds good.
Feel free, Bryce. Okay. But my final question is, so put your shoes in maybe someone who's like me and Bryce who just graduated university.
Yeah.
We're both interested in tech. What do you think you would be doing if you were in our shoes, or what advice would you give to someone in our shoes? Would you get into, like, what would you study? Where would you maybe start your career? And especially with startups, if that's an interest, where do you start with that? Do you just dive right in with an idea that you have, or you maybe work for like an Amazon and gain some expertise in some field?
Yeah. So there's like a few different questions in there. So what do you study? I don't know. Like everybody tells you the same thing, right? Or they'll tell you to study what you studied. Mm-hmm. I think studying software was very helpful for me.
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying. Maybe that's going to change, but until it does, I would say that's gives you a really big leg up in the world of tech. Mm-hmm. The question around like work experience and like, what's the right amount of work experience? Like, I think the thing is if you have no experience at all, it's very hard to generate ideas that are outside of like, it's going to be things like software for for students, like
Yeah.
exchanging notes, or it's all that stuff we were talking about before, like the tarpit ideas, because that's all you know, right? But I also don't think it takes. Some people are like, oh, I have to spend like a decade working at Google or something. I don't think it takes that long either, right? You need a little bit. Like I was okay with just my internships, right? I worked 4 terms at ATI, 2 terms at Amazon, and I think that was, you gain a lot just from even a little bit of industry experience. And so whether you do that over co-op terms or just a couple of years of work experience, I think is pretty helpful.
And would you target working specifically at AI companies, or like what type of companies? Like if you were entering the workforce right now, what would you go into?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I think probably giving AI companies a try would be interesting, but I don't think that's almost more of a preference thing.
Yeah.
Like, in a sense, actually, I think working at even stuff outside of tech, like just traditional certain kinds of businesses where you just so that you gain some sort of experience of like, oh, okay, this is how this business could be automated. And that happens in tech too, right? Because there's a lot in tech where like you can actually the waves of automation hit tech first, so which is what happened for us, right? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have like a super solid opinion on the like in tech versus not in tech, and I've seen people be very successful both ways.
I have a question kind of specific around AI, progressing AI, eventually AGI, universal basic income. When the time comes for something like that, what are your thoughts on if that would be of benefit to society, and do you think that's something that we should be talking about more nowadays? Because the technology seems to be progressing in that these directions where work will change drastically. And what are your overall thoughts on stuff like that?
I don't know that I have I haven't done like a lot of thinking around this stuff. I don't know. I mean, maybe at some point in the future we'll get to a spot where that's like an appropriate and good thing to do. I think it just remains to be seen. I think we're still a ways. I'm not like much of a. I don't believe like AGI is like the next 2 years it's going to happen. I think we're still a good ways out. A good ways out from that.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for inviting us to your home and letting us interview you. You shared a lot of expertise with us today. We are walking away from this learning a lot, and hopefully our listeners are also taking away quite a bit. I know they will. And yeah, the stories you shared were awesome, and thank you so much for taking the time with us.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you.